Good afternoon, I'm the Modern Warfare historian and today we will talk about the V-2 rocket. Last time we discussed on how it was used. Today we will learn about its development after the Second World War. Now, let's get started. In episode 2 we learned that von Braun's team was recruited in the US in order to develop the rockets. The Americans were after the scientists and technicians for quite some time, as they feared that if von Braun had surrendered to the Soviets, the Reds would have had a technological upper hand. And the US needed an upper hand as they realized that, in the future, there would be some tensions with the Soviet Union. American generals saw the potential of the V-2 as a delivery method for their new gadget, the atomic bomb. Von Braun and his team were transferred to Fort Bliss, a military base near El Paso, Texas. However, they had a rough start because the US decided to invest more in bombers as a delivery method for nuclear warheads. The difference between Germany and the US can be found in fundings, as he stated, "At Peenemünde we had been coddled. Here we are counting pennies." The team helped to rebuild captured V-2s and train military, industrial and university personnel. A funny yet true story is that the facility that produced the V-2 was inside the territory that, after the war, was placed under Soviet control. So the Americans rushed to remove and ship out almost everything interesting they found inside, and with this the Soviets failed to obtain any technical drawing. The used facility, placed deep into a mountainside, was emptied in one of the largest movements of equipment in less than 1 month, taking back home engines and parts for hundreds of rockets. These V-2s were used as sounding rockets, basically a rocket that brings instruments in atmospheric flight and takes measurements. With the California Institute of Technology, they developed the RTVG-4 bumper, a V-2 with an additional second stage called War Corporal. Bumper 8, the 8th flight, was the first launch from Cape Canaveral from Part 3. After the bumper, the legacy of the V-2 continued with the Jupiter, the Juno, and the Saturn I rocket. The Germans that went with the Americans did so after a daring evacuation to the south of Germany. Not everyone, however, decided to follow them, and those were found by the Soviets in villages near Peenemünde and the production factory, who recruited them to recreate the technical papers of the V-2 from the ground up, as all papers had been burned or taken away by von Braun. The German team working for the Soviets was even able to build in record times a working engine under the guide of Helmut Gertrup. He took up the task to oversee the recreation of the technical papers, having been assured that he could remain in Germany. However, the Soviets had other plans, and in October 1946 the Rocketeers and their families were put on a train and sent to a secret research bureau in Gorodomlaya Island in central Russia. While the Americans were using von Braun as their chief engineer, the Soviet Union had a strange couple on top. The chief designer was Sergei Korolev, who was an ex-Gulag inmate who was released to lead the motherland in the quest for space. One of his closest helpers, Valentin Glushko, was appointed chief of OKB 456, a bureau specialized in rocket engines. However, they both hated each other. In fact, Korolev was in a gulag because of Glushko's announcement during the Great Purges. The Soviets copied the V-2 and their version was called the R-1. They later developed around 1941 a bigger version called R-2. There are a lot of differences between the two, even though those two types of rocket are related. The R-2 had a range more than double, from 270 km to at least 600 km. The cone that contained the warhead could be detached before atmospheric re-entry, therefore solving the problem of how to keep a rocket intact while it comes back down. That was a big weakness of the V-2. Its weight was around 19.6 tons and was 17.70 meters high, while the R-1 was 13.4 tons and 40 meters high. The structure had some changes too. The V-2 and R-1 had the structural load on the hull, while the R-2 used the tanks as structural part, and this reduced overall weight. The tail cone was made of steel and not aluminum, and the control section was moved from above the tanks to above the engine. This made easier pre-launch preparation. Radio guidance was introduced, and this enabled the R2 to be way more accurate than its predecessor. 15,045 R1 and R2 were produced up to 1955. The R2 was too small for early Russian nuclear devices, so most of the rockets had a high explosive warhead. There have been some studies on how to create a sort of dirty bomb with nuclear waste. The Giran version was developed as an airburst model that would create a radioactive rain over the target. The generator version, on the opposite, would release its radioactive liquid as it impacted the ground. Those two variants were tested, but there is no information if those were deployed. Finally, in 1954, a fission warhead was developed and tested to be used on the R2. It was accepted into service in 1956, but by that time the Soviet Union was already testing more modern missiles. Around 1958, in fact, the R-11, also called Scud A, was starting to replace the R-1 and 2 as the main tactical missile. There is a general myth that the Scud that is still in service in these days in some countries, albeit in a more modern version, is a derivative of the V-2. This is not so true, as the Scud was developed to replace the R-2, as this one used liquid oxygen and alcohol, while the more practical solution of the R-11 was to use hypergolic fuels, that are a mixture of toxic liquids that when they touch each other they automatically combust. The main advantage, however, is that hypergolics are a storable propellant, while liquid oxygen tend to boil off and the alcohol tends to magically disappear at the same time that drunk people start to pop up around the base. The Soviet R-2 was important not only for its country but also for China, as it was exporting under a 1956 agreement, but because of the degrading political relationship between the two, the production of the Chinese copy, called Dongfeng 1, meaning East Wind 1, was started in late 1960. In November and December of that year, the first tests were made. However, the Chinese were not that happy with the deployment of an outdated missile type, so they started working on the Dongfeng 2, that is suspiciously very similar to the Soviet R-5 Pobeda, meaning victory in Russian. The Dongfeng 1 is considered the last direct descendant of the V-2, and its rocket family, Dongfeng, is still used by China as its backbone for the military and civilian rocket programs. The French understood the importance of ballistic missiles very early, and just after World War II they created the, sorry for the pronunciation, Laboratoire de Recherche Ballistique et Aérodynamique, called LRBA, Ballistic and Aerodynamic Research Laboratory. Here they merged the V-2 technology and even some personnel with the EA-41 Iolo rocket that was developed in the interwar period and was improved by the Free French forces during World War II between 1942 and 1945. My guess is that this was done in the Saharan desert, but I was not able to find anything useful on this. The addition of German technology and expertise gave birth to the Super V-2 rocket. This model was developed in 1946 and 47, and it's quite interesting yet unknown. The French Center for the Study of Self-Propelled Missiles had recruited in 1946 around 30 German engineers that had worked at Peenemünde. They were settled in Vernon, halfway between Paris and Rouen. They developed Project 4211, a two-stage rocket that was developed with original V-2 technology. They were even able to recreate around 75 of the original supply chain, because a lot of components for the V-2 were made in France and in French occupied zone. For those who don't know, the French occupied zone was the part of Germany controlled by, you guessed it, French after World War II. It included the Rhineland, Baden and Württemberg-Hohenzollern. Again, sorry for the pronunciation. However, the CAPA was not able to obtain the remaining 25% of parts because of the USA and the Soviet Union, who both refused to supply them. There were also some problems with the construction of test facilities in France and French-occupied Algeria, therefore there was a change of plan. The work on Project 4211 was redirected towards Project 4212, that was a French spin-off of the German aggregate program. This was on the exterior similar to a V-2, but with a more powerful engine, with new storable propellants. There were 4 variants of the Super V-2, and if you're interested in the subject, there are some Wikipedia articles in the description. The third variant, the V-2, was the first French strategic ballistic missile put into production. However, even though French program was interesting, the fourth version of the project V-2 was even able to hit Russia from France with 3,600 kilometers range. The French government decided that they will not fund them. French funds were being relocated to project V-2 called Veronique, a small sounding rocket. This small rocket was built between 1950 and 1969 in several versions, and the work on this model led to the Diamant rocket that placed the first French satellite in orbit, and this rocket led to the Ariane family of rockets that still flies today. Last but not least, we have a very weird but interesting rocket that, had it received the necessary funding, would have made an interesting what-if scenario. I'm talking about the British Megarock. On the 23rd of December 1946, the renowned space artist R.A. Smith, who will later become the president of the British Interplanetary Society, proposed to the Ministry of Supply a re-engineered V-2 capable of bringing a British pilot into space and bringing him back safely to the ground after a suborbital flight. Sadly for Mr. Smith, the proposal was rejected, and the same fate occurred to dozens of proposals for a British manned spaceflight over the following decade. And it was not only about space. The British government made a lot of mistakes, even in the aircraft fields, but I may discuss this topic in another video if you're interested. Anyway, the Megarock can be considered a spin-off of the V-2, even though almost nothing of the original rocket remained. The body was larger and longer, the orientation of the turbopump was different, and it had no aerodynamic fins. The design was intended to carry a 586 kg unpressured capsule to a height of 300 kilometers that will then come back after a ballistic flight and open the parachute at 113 kilometers. Thanks to variable thrust level and the size of the parachute, the expected G-forces on the pilot was expected to not be above 3.3. However, there was still an option of a deadman switch that would pass the control to the ground crew. Here we will end the journey in the analysis in V-2, a truly revolutionary weapon that was ahead decades from its time, and this explains why its legacy continues in various shapes and forms even today. Thank you for watching, and remember to never drink hypergolic propellants.